Hi friends, we at GLC would like to take a quick moment to thank you for watching our programs on this platform, and we'd like to ask you for a little favor. Would you please go beneath this video and click the subscribe button? Did you know that by simply subscribing to the GLC YouTube channel, you can help us financially support the programs on this platform? You'll need to be signed into YouTube beforehand, but if not, simply click the subscribe button and YouTube will automatically walk you through the steps to sign in or to create an account. By taking these simple steps, you will not only ensure that you continue to receive our unique programming and gain instant access to the hundreds of videos we post, but more importantly, you'll also be telling YouTube that GLC's content is worth watching and promoting. Likewise, if you enjoyed a specific program, please click the thumbs up button below, which also helps inform YouTube that this is a program worth recommending. Finally, once you have logged in and subscribed, please click the notification bell below in order to receive announcements when we post new content. As usual, feel free to post your questions and comments in the comments section below. We always love hearing from our friends and viewers. Again, thank you for watching and supporting God's Learning Channel. We couldn't spread the message of the gospel without you. Be blessed, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Shalom. Welcome to the Wild Branch Ministry, and welcome to Paul putting words in my mouth. And we're going to tackle another subject in this segment called the weak and beggarly elements, which is something that Paul writes to the Galatians about in the book of Galatians. I want to remind you, even before we begin to discuss this subject, that the Hebrew word for the exile, knowing, the Father knows that His people, i.e. the lost sheep of the house of Israel, are going to be scattered throughout all the nations in an exile because of sin. That's the way the Father always does things. As I said before, He doesn't take our heads off because we sin, thank goodness. He generally exiles His people, especially as a group of people. And so He knew from the very beginning that we would be scattered all throughout all the nations, that we once again mix with their religious systems, and not just mix religiously and take upon their ways of even thinking, but we would physically mix. I mean, they would take upon wives of the Gentiles and wives of the various heathen countries and so forth. And so they've not only mixed physically, but they've mixed spiritually with them. And so in this process of bringing them out, as He sends His disciples, according to Acts chapter 1, verse 8, He sends His fishermen out to fish for them. And the fact that they've mixed with all these people, we don't know. He knows. So there's no such thing as lost sheep from His point of view, because He's God, okay? It's from our point of view. We don't know who they are. And as I said before, we discover this concept because I've heard lots of people say, well, there's no such thing as the lost tribes of the house of Israel. Really? There's no such thing as the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Lost tribes and so forth? You mean you know where they're at? Let's get together sometime and have some coffee and give me a list of where they're at and their addresses and their names and so forth. I'd like to know where they're at. The reality that we discover every day of the week is that people are all over the world are discovering their backgrounds, discovering where they come, so forth and so forth, that they didn't know before. The concept of lost here is really based upon finding out who you are. The identity was lost and so forth, and now we know who we are. It's misplaced. In other words, we're not where we should be. That's really the concept of lost. I mean, when I lose something, it's in another place, not where I expected it to be. And so we travel throughout all the world, and we're discovering the background of these people. Instead of being in the land of Israel, living in Israel right now, well, guess what? They're in Germany, and they're in Africa, and they're in Australia, and they're in China. And they seem to be in where we would not expect Israel to be, the tip of South Africa, in Ethiopia and Kenya and so forth. That's the concept of lost here. So the Father already knows as His people are scattered throughout all the earth that He's going to send His disciples out to begin the process of gathering the lost tribes back into the land. And when they do so, there's all kinds of mixed up stuff that they bring out with them. And that's the reality of what He's dealing with, particularly in the book of Galatians. So it's no coincidence that the word galut in Hebrew is Galatians. Galatians, because when we open up the book of Galatians, the first thing we read is Paul, an apostle, not of men, neither by man, but by Yeshua the Messiah, and God the Father who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren which are with me unto the churches or the assemblies of Galatia. Peace be to you, and peace from God the Father and from our Adonai Yeshua the Messiah. And so the book of Galatians is based upon the exile. And so he's going to the brethren in Galatia. And for the most part, these people are not Jews who have been practicing in the synagogues and so forth. They're his brethren mixed among the Gentiles and have taken upon their ways and their customs. And for the most part, nobody knows who they are. That's why we are sent with the gospel, the good news of Yeshua the Messiah, to all the whosoevers of the world. He knows where they're at. He's the husbandman. He knows where he plants the seed. We don't know where it is. So we go out into all the whosoevers of the world. And so he's writing to a group of people that have been serving all kinds of other gods, including, as Paul alludes to in the book of Acts, an unknown God. And so they've been serving all these systems, all their lives, who have had their various observances of days and months and times and years and so forth. And that's who he's dealing with. He's not dealing with Jews who have been living their lives according to the Torah. He's dealing with Gentiles scattered throughout the nations. And so that's how he begins his letter. Now, I want to talk about, before we get into reading this, some common false assumptions that I've addressed in the past programs that I want to address once again, just as a reminder. Number one, the word law in the New Testament is referring to the law, to the Torah of the law of Yahweh. That's one of the first assumptions that we have, is that every time you see the word law, it's referring to the Torah. Not so. That is not so. The second assumption that we should not make is that any mention of feast or observances in the Bible is talking about the 7 feasts of Yahweh. That's not true either. Guess what? I know this may be a huge newsflash to some of us, but other religions have their festivals and feasts as well. Judaism is not the only one who has festivals and things and celebrations that they observe. I know that's a newsflash to some of you, but the reality is all these cultures and all these religions have these things. And the people that Paul is speaking to have come out of these things. Another assumption, Jews are the only people, as I just said, who observe days and months and years. That's not true. That's a wrong assumption. Another assumption is that any negative comments that Yeshua or Paul makes are directed at the Jews. That we're always seen to be, whether consciously or unconsciously, we all kind of direct those things at the Yehudim or the Jews. Another common assumption is the church began at Pentecost. I think we've talked about that before, but it bears telling again. A common assumption is the church began at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. As a matter of fact, it happens to be the basis for a whole lot of hymns and a whole lot of modern day songs as well. You know, in the upper room, and we're going to attack the book of Acts, by the way, later, but in the upper room, the Holy Spirit comes down in cloven tongues of fire, and they weren't even in the upper room. The upper room is the chapter before that. They're at the temple. You don't go to the upper room of somebody's house to observe Shavuot or Pentecost. You go to the temple. They're not in some upper room somewhere. That is a meeting that they had 10 days before that in a whole different chapter, as a matter of fact. So a common assumption is it began there. Not so. That word ecclesia, which is the word that's translated as the English word church in your New Testament, is all over the Old Testament. It begins in the beginning, which is a good place to begin. It's there all along. And so it did not begin at Pentecost. Now, the regathering, the beginning of the regathering of the 2 tribes, so 2 would be 1 flock, 1 fold, if you will, with 1 shepherd. That began then as the Holy Spirit sends them out to go out and to gather the lost sheep of the house of Israel scattered all over the earth. Yes, that did begin then. But the church did not begin at Pentecost. Another common assumption is that Israel is only those who physically come from the loins of Jacob. That's a common assumption we make, that every time you read the word Israel, it's talking about only those who physically come from the loins of Jacob. When Paul tried to make it very clear in Romans chapter 9 that not all Israel is of Israel. As a matter of fact, he goes on specifically to tell almost the opposite of the way it's generally understood to be when he says, the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God. Now remember, the context is Israel. He's talking about Israel here. Israel from man's eyes is not the same as Israel from God's eyes. Israel from God's eyes has always been, ever since you have its beginning. When did Israel begin? Jacob, a person called Jacob, who was called Israel because he prevailed, if you will, and had power and so forth of God. And so that's when he's called that. So all those who come from his loins, physically from his loins, who believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because it's not the children of the flesh that are the children of God, it's the children of the promise that are counted as the seed, Paul says in Romans chapter 9, verse 8. And so if you physically belong to Israel, in other words, you come directly from his loins and so forth, and you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you follow him, then you are Israel. If you are a stranger and a sojourner, and you do not physically come from the loins of Abraham, but you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you are grafted in. In other words, you weren't there naturally, you were grafted in. And so now you, in God's eyes, are Israel. You are one with the commonwealth of Israel, no longer strangers and sojourners, Paul says, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. The reason we say household, because there's only been one from the very beginning. But it divided. See, the Bible begins with a house, and in the end, it's going to end with one house. Started with one house, is going to end with one house, because the end is revealed out of the beginning. But in between this time, the house got divided. And really, simply, all the prophecies are all about only the Messiah can reunite those two houses. Only he can do that. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, which is not our subject now. But to bring them back to oneness. The Father is in the business of echad, bringing things back into unity and oneness. And so that is the subject, okay, of what Paul is talking about when he talks about Israel. That if you are physically from Israel, the loins of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you don't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you don't believe in the God of Israel, then Paul says your branch is cut off and it's laying out in the dirt. We've talked about this before. I hate to be too redundant here. So the bottom line is, a branch from a natural tree laying in the dirt is not producing the fruit of the natural tree. A branch in a wild olive tree over here is not producing the fruit of the natural tree. Neither one is producing the fruit. So the one that was cut off and laying in the dirt, it has to be grafted back in. And the one over here in the wild olive tree, that would be most of us listening to my voice right now, has to be grafted in to the tree as well. It's the same with the Jew and the Gentile. That's why Paul mentions there is neither Jew nor Gentile in the body of Messiah. And so Paul makes a distinction between these things. And so once again, Jew and Israel are not the same thing. Now remember, Paul is writing to new converts in Galatia once again, who were being bewitched by some who were saying that the Spirit is received by the works of the law. Now that phrase, works of the law, he didn't say who were deceived by the law of Moses. He didn't say that, but he uses the phrase works of the law. Ma'aseh Torah, that is a specific phrase that's very unique and peculiar to Judaism, and it happens to be the writings of the rabbis. Okay? And that is what it's referring to, and you've heard that familiar thing before many times as well anyway. And so the idea is that you do not receive the Spirit by keeping the works of the law. You don't receive the Spirit of God by keeping any laws, Roman laws, Greek laws, etc., etc. It's got to be a gift from Him and received by Him. You didn't receive it by anything that you do, and you're technically not going to keep it that way as well. And so once again, this letter is not, I want to get the background here, is not written to Torah-observant Jews, but to new Gentile converts in Galatia. That's who the letter is written to. We must keep that in mind. So when we go to Galatians chapter 4, here's what it says. Now remember, I can't help but quote in a few things in Galatians chapter 3. Paul is telling us that if you are the Messiah's, then you are one in Him. And then he goes on to say that Well, where is it at here? I'll find it. I got this Bible. That you are neither Jew, he goes on to say, for as many of you have been baptized unto Messiah, have put on Messiah. There is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for all are one in the Messiah Yeshua. And if you be the Messiahs, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So the contrast is he's speaking to this Gentile converts, and he says that you are all one in the Messiah now. And if you are grafted in him, then there's no difference between the two. Now, some people like to say that, using the contrast of Jew and Gentile, but yes, in the Messiah, in other words, the entrance into the kingdom doesn't make any difference whether you're a Jew or Gentile. But obviously, once you're in the kingdom, there's still a big difference between the Jew and the Gentile. Oh, really? Now, what do they use as an example? Well, what Paul said here. Right here it says, "Ye are neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, but all are one in Messiah." So the logic that some people use is, well, obviously, even after you believe in the Messiah and have found this new freedom and now serving him in righteousness, obviously there's still a difference between males and females. Look at a male, look at a female. So see? Nothing's changed. The male still has the things that they're required to do, and the female has the things that they're required to do. They're looking at the physical. If you understand the culture at the time, and even some major well-known religious systems today, you'll see the context of the reason why Paul said that. Because in the religions of those days, and it's still true in Islam, for example, today, the females, the women, were second-class citizens. They stayed home barefoot and pregnant, if you will. They were at home washing the dishes and taking care of the children. And it was the men, this is true in many Jewish sects as well, it was the men that went to the synagogues and studied the Torah. Remember the movie Yentl? You see that movie with Barbara Streisand? She was a woman, but she lived in a manly culture where all the men do everything concerning service in the temple and worship of God, and the women were just relegated to sit home and pat the little kids on the head and breastfeed and things like that. And so the women were relegated to these second-class positions. The reason Paul's comparing male and female is not because the body of a male is different from the body of the female. He's trying to say, whether you're male or female, you both now have a responsibility and an obligation and a privilege, I use all three of those, to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is not a male-dominated thing. This is for males and females, so you can both worship now in the kingdom. Females aren't relegated to washing dishes and taking care of the kids. And that's the context of what Paul's trying to say. Many religions, once again, still do that today. Paul's not comparing the body of a male to the body of a female, but rather, no matter what you were on the outside, relegate bond nor free, you're all free in the Messiah. And you all have the privilege of worshiping and serving God together in the Messiah. And you all, whether Jew or Gentile, follow the same rules, follow the same Torah, follow the same commandments. Why? Because you're all in one tree, and that tree starts with a seed. And so you all receive the same sustenance and nutrition from the same one seed. So Paul's not contrasting the bodies of male and female when he talks about being one in them. So we set the tone before you even get to Galatians chapter 4, because we're going to be in this chapter the next time too, with the allegory of Sarah and Hagar a little bit later. But right now, he's talking about being adopted and so forth, the whole concept of adoption. And then he goes on in Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. And here's what he says. Now remember, his audience is these people coming out from among the Gentiles who have mixed themselves with the Gentiles. And when he calls them, many will come out, many will not. As a matter of fact, maybe I should switch that and say a remnant will come out, but many will not come out of Babylon. That's the reality of what he has to deal with, because these things are already prophesied. So his audience is not Torah-observant Jews. His audience is the lost sheep of the house of Israel, mixed among the nations and taken upon their pagan ways. And so that's the background when he says in Galatians 4, 8 through 10. He says, "Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, that ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods." So he's saying, how is it that when you did not know God? Now remember who he's talking to. They didn't know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What were they doing? They were worshiping all kinds of other gods, Mithraism and so forth. All these things were dominant religions in the first century. And so he says to them who were not worshiping God and didn't know him. So once again, it's not Torah observant Jews. And he goes on to say, but now, after that ye have known God, of course, now that they're in the kingdom, if you will, he said, or rather known of God, how turn ye again into the weak and beggarly elements whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? Now, much religious teaching teaches that that's people who are trying to return back to the Torah, to back keeping the commandments. Once again, these people never kept the commandments in the first place. These are not Torah-observant Jews who have left the Torah, and he's wondering why you're trying to go back to the Torah. These are Gentiles, if you will, mixed together, who know nothing of the commandments of God, who have all their other observances in their own days of the week and so forth, and they've been observing these things, and they did not know the God of Israel. And so he's telling them that why are you going back to the system you were in before? Once again, the Torah also, we just covered this in the Romans Week in the Faith thing, the Torah is never called weak and beggarly elements, wherein you desire to be again in bondage. It's never called that. Then he goes on to relate the same thing is true with circumcision, if you will. They had the same problems. Galatians chapter 2, verse 4, for example. Earlier on, he says, verse 3, he says, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren, unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in the Messiah Yeshua, that they might bring us into bondage. He's talking about false brethren. In other words, they're saying things that aren't true. Now, the reality is that in the first century, various Jewish sects were running around wooing converts. As a matter of fact, Yeshua talks about it going, encompassing land and sea, that you would go in order to get one convert. And then when you do, you make him twofold more a child of hell than yourselves. Yeshua talks about that in Matthew chapter 23. So what's known in the first century is there were various sects of Judaism, just like there is today. If you've ever been in the land, you know there's various sects all over the place, who each one of them had their own unique way, even of circumcising, to bring in a new convert. They had a unique way of doing it. And many times, believe it or not, if they were circumcised by some other system, they would have to be re-circumcised to enter into their system. See, this is a representation of religious systems. I'm going to propose another thing to you that might come in shock to you, even though we're not dealing with circumcision in this series. I'm going to propose to you that Paul never really addresses whether you should or should not be circumcised once you're a believer. I don't believe he ever even addresses the subject. He's constantly addressing these circumcisions by his own brethren in the flesh without faith. He's always apologetically having to deal with the fact that his own brethren in the flesh are running around circumcising converts to bring them into their kingdom, if you will, and they haven't been circumcised of the heart. So Paul's saying, what good does that do you? What good does it do to run around circumcising the foreskins of everybody if your foreskin of your heart has not been circumcised? That's the context of Paul addressing circumcision. And so the same is true with circumcision as it is with this concept that we're dealing with right now, the whole concept of bondage. Because he says, the weak and beggarly elements, why do you want to return and be back in bondage again? Remember in Yochanan or John chapter 8, Yeshua is talking once again to his brethren in the flesh, and he turns to them and they said, remember they said to him, we are Abraham's seed and we were never in bondage to any man. Now, of course, that's not true right off the bat. Egypt, I think there were some bondage things going on there in Egypt, and what's so laughable about that is they're currently under the bondage of the Romans. Even as they spoke, they were saying they were under the bondage of Romans. And so Yeshua, remember, he turns to his own brethren in the flesh and he says, now I know that you are Abraham's seed, referring to the physical. In other words, you have physically been circumcised. But he says, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. So he's saying, you've done the outside thing, but that's not what enters a person into the kingdom of God. You have to have your heart circumcised. And of course, it's always been like that. It's never been any other way. And so he recognizes the fact that they have just been physically circumcised. That's what Paul had to deal with all the time as well. And he says, because of false brethren brought in unawares, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Messiah Yeshua, that they might bring us into bondage. Now that's that same word used in Galatians chapter 4 here, of what these people are trying to do. So he gets to the conclusion of this, and he says, ye observe days and months and times and years. Days and months and times and years. Now what do we automatically assume from that, based upon the way we were trained? That he's talking about Jewish. He's talking about the feast of the Lord. He's talking about Shabbat. He's talking about Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and so forth. And that's the context of what he's talking about. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, the word observe there in Hebrew is parat. It's the word used in Hebrew. In Greek is ereo. And it means to watch. It's translated as the concept of watch. But it's the normal Greek word for days and months and times and so forth. And once again, they're dealing with the Gnostics and a mosaic of observances of Hindus, Hellenists, Babylonians, Egyptians, Persians, Kabbalists, if you will, that kind of attitude, Mandean, Gnosis, and Zoroastrianism. He's dealing with all these cultures at the time. And every one of those that I just mentioned, and including Mithraism, had their own days and months and times and special events that they observed from one generation to the next. And these are the systems that these Galatians that Paul is speaking to have come out of. But he's saying, now that you have known God. So apparently some of these people are drifting back into what they did before. And they've come into this understanding, they're walking this walk, and now they're wanting to go back to their... Do you know anybody like that? Who even though they're walking this direction, they insist on going back to the things that the Father just freed them from, back to the Sabbaths and the times and the days and the years that they were just freed from. And so Paul's trying to tell them that don't go back to that, because that was bondage to you. That was the things you served with the old man, the old nature. You have a new nature now. Serve him with newness of life and walk according to righteousness in your life and follow his feast and his Sabbaths, and don't return back into the bondage that you got from your old ones. America right now is full of that bondage. One of the most stressful times of the year is coming up very soon once again. And I would have... suffice it to say, many people financially are in bondage the months following this time of the year, every year, because we follow these things. So we're going to continue along with some of the things that Paul said and identify them until we see you next time. Cling to your roots, and your days may be long, and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. Once again, Shalom Aleichem.